You read that right. Free drum samples. What's up everybody, Mike here. And I just released a brand new and totally free drum sample pack, now available over at bettermixes.com, called the House Kit. I just figured I'd make a quick video going over the drums and mic setup I used to create this sample pack, and then hop into Pro Tools to show you how they sound and what they can add to your mixes and productions. So for the kick drum, I started with my vintage Gretsch round badge kick. It's super big and punchy sounding, and I absolutely love it. But I mic'd that up with an Audio-Technica ATM25 about halfway inside the drum, and a Lauten Clarion on the outside, a few inches off the reso head. Then for the snare, I used my 7x14 Empire Red Oak stave drum. I actually built this drum myself, built the shell from a plank of wood and everything. I had built maybe a dozen or so snares a while back. Some got used on some really big records. One is actually owned by one of my favorite engineers of all time, Ryan Hewitt. But I don't really plan on making any more, at least not anytime soon. So here's your chance to get the sounds of one of these in your tracks. But anyway, I mic'd that up with a pair of SM57s on top and bottom. Then for toms, I really want to make this sample pack as useful as possible, so I decided to go with 4 toms. Most of my sample packs have 2 toms, with 1 or 2 having 3, but I figured having 4 would give everyone a lot of options. I used 12 and 14-inch Pearl Session Studio Select toms and 10 and 14-inch Gretsch USA toms, and I tried to tune them in such a way that a lot of different combinations would work well together. Like if you just want 2 toms, you can go with the 12 and 16 and get a big beefy kind of sound, or the 10 and 14 for something a little higher and punchier. Or for 3 toms, pretty much any combination will sound natural together. But I mic'd all the toms up with Lauten LS308s. And then to capture the whole kit, I'm using a pair of SE RN17s for overheads and a pair of Vanguard V13s in Omni as room mics. But now let's check out what you get when you download the samples. You'll see here that you've got both a TCI and WAV folder. If you're a Slate Trigger user, you can drag the contents of the TCI folder into your Trigger Samples folder, and you'll be all set. But you've also got all the WAV files if you want to use them with another sampler. And if we jump into the WAV folder, you'll see that we've got our kick, snare, and toms. And for each one of those, you've got separate files for the close mics, the overheads, and the room mics, as well as a blend of all 3. And then for each of those, we've got the individual hits. For the snare, there are 5 different velocities with 7 hits each, so that you can get really natural sounding dynamics and rolls. For the toms, we've got 3 velocities with 7 hits each, and the same goes for the kick. This is actually the first pack I've done with multiple velocities for the kick. I usually prefer a single velocity on kicks myself, as I don't really like how the amount of low end and overall tone of the kick changes at different velocities, but I've had a bunch of people request it, so here it is. And you can always just use a single velocity if you prefer. I'll show you how to do that in Trigger in a minute. But now let's open up Pro Tools and actually take a listen to this pack. I've got a MIDI drum loop here from EZdrummer, and a few instances of Trigger replacing the actual drums themselves. So the cymbals are EZdrummer, but everything else is just this sample pack. And that's just the blend option of each of these drums, and the only additional processing is a clipper on the master, just barely touching anything to bring the level up. So that's what you'll get just by dropping these samples in. But of course, you've got some options to customize it as well. Maybe that's a little bit too roomy for you. You can just drop the separate close, overhead, and room mic files into Trigger and make your own blend. And they take additional processing really well too. Maybe you're working on a metal track and want to click your kick. You can just throw on an EQ, crank some top end, maybe pull out a bit of mids, and there we go. In like 10 seconds, you go from a rock kick to a metal kick. Same thing with our snare. If you want something a little bit more aggressive, we can boost some top and bottom, maybe add a bit of extra compression, and there we go. And don't forget, we've also got some options on the toms. So far, we've just been listening to the 12 and 16-inch toms, but now let's try swapping those out for the 10 and 14. Oh, and I mentioned earlier that I'd show you how to use a single velocity on the kick and trigger. To do that, just go to the View Curves window and play with the range knobs. First, I'll turn the linking on so it applies to all the samples, and then if I bring the max knob down, now I'm only getting medium and soft hits, which can be cool if you want a little more bass and less attack. Or you can bring the minimum knob up if you only want the hard hits. This can be helpful on the snare samples too. You can bring the max knob down a bit to get rid of the hardest velocity if you don't want the rim shots in there. And of course, these work great with live drums too, not just MIDI. Here's an example where I'm using the close mic samples to reinforce the live drums, and then I'm using the room samples on separate tracks to make these drums sound like they were recorded in a much bigger space. Those room samples really add a ton. That's definitely a trick worth trying if you're working in a really small home studio. But yeah, if you want to grab these samples for yourself, I'll put a link in the description. I really hope you enjoy these samples, and if you do, I've got a bunch of other samples on my site that you might want to check out as well. Thanks so much for watching, and happy mixing.